Hello, everyone. My name is Ezra Swan, and I am the Policy Associate at CARE Washington, where I lead our policy work as an organization. I'm here today with a special guest, Patricio Marquez from the Attorney General's Office, as a part of our Housing Know Your Rights campaign interview series. And the goal of this campaign really is to provide entry-level housing rights information to our community members about their rights in Washington state. So let's get started. Patricio, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Certainly. And first of all, good afternoon, Najma, and thank you so much for having me. I'm an attorney with the Civil Rights Division of the Washington State Attorney General's Office. Our division is a little bit on the newer side when it comes to the work of the Attorney General's Office. We were created in January of 2015 by our current Attorney General, Bob Ferguson. When he took that position, which is an elected position, he found it odd that the top lawyers for the state didn't have a civil rights team who enforced civil rights laws. And so he implemented them. And we have since grown from a team of one attorney at the time to we've now exceeded 20 total staff persons. That includes a number of attorneys plus investigators and professional support staff. And what we do is that we enforce state and federal civil rights laws, which includes our own Washington state law against discrimination. And we enforce those laws on behalf of the people of the state. And these laws, I guess generally say that these laws protect Washingtonians against discrimination in a number of instances. So, for example, by their housing provider, by their employer, in credit and insurance transactions, by businesses open to the public, and by city and county government. And what our team does is that we investigate and bring cases where there are discriminatory policies and practices that are affecting a number of Washingtonians. So like where there are patterns and practices of discrimination that are having broader effects. In addition to that work that we do sort of directly for our office, we also have the role of representing another state agency called the Washington State Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Commission sort of has separate independent authority by which they receive and investigate individual complaints of violations of the discrimination, state law against discrimination in the areas that I discussed.
And can you tell us a little bit about what exactly housing discrimination looks like, and who should you report to if you're an individual getting discriminated against? And does that differ if you're a group of tenants trying to report discrimination?
Sure. So I guess generally speaking, housing discrimination is when a landlord or another sort of form of housing provider treats a tenant or a prospective tenant, somebody who's looking to rent a unit, differently because of race, citizenship, or immigration status, or based on some other protected characteristic. And there are several protected characteristics under our state law against discrimination. And I cite that specific statute because our state law is just really broad and very protective. And I think it's important for Washingtonians to know sort of who it covers. And our state law against discrimination prohibits housing discrimination based on, and I'm going to bear with me because I'm going to read the list of protected characteristics, but based on sex, marital status, sexual orientation, race, religion, color, national origin, citizenship or immigration status, families with children status, veteran or military status, and disability or the use of a service animal. And these broad protections also apply not just to sort of landlords and tenants, but to other real estate transactions. So like if you're buying a house, you also are protected against discrimination on the basis of these protected characteristics. Now, in terms of what housing discrimination looks like, I'll provide a few examples that hopefully will help illustrate. One example would be a landlord who refuses to rent to someone because of their race, national origin, citizenship or immigration status, or because they're a family with children, for example. Another instance of housing discrimination would be treating tenants differently based on a protected characteristic. So let's say, for example, that a landlord has rules for their apartment complex that everybody has to abide by, but they enforce those rules differently on tenants of color. For example, let's say they have a rule that said no one is allowed to park in certain parking spaces in our parking lot for more than 24 hours. And several tenants regularly violate this rule. But ultimately, the apartment complex only tows the cars that belong to tenants of color. That would be housing discrimination. Another example would be sexual harassment by a landlord. A landlord's not allowed to make unwelcome sexual comments or touch a tenant in inappropriate ways, let alone make these comments or sort of ask for sexual activity in exchange for a break on rent or some other required obligation that the landlord already has. That would be housing discrimination. And I'll give one last example. For example, evicting an immigrant family who speaks up about their rights or files a housing discrimination complaint because their landlord is applying the rules differently to them. That would be a form of housing discrimination too. And in terms of who you should report to if you're an individual that is experiencing some form of discrimination, for example, those complaints can be brought to the Washington State Human Rights Commission. I talked about them earlier. They're a separate state agency from us, but they are our client. And you can find information in multiple languages about how to submit a complaint at their website, and I'll provide the web address, which is www.hum for human rights.wa, which is wa.gov, G-O-V. They can also be reached by telephone at 1-800-233-3247. Now, let's say you're a group of tenants who want to report discrimination because you're experiencing a pattern and practice of discrimination that's affecting a number of Washingtonians. In that instance, those tenants should feel free to contact our office, again, the Civil Rights Division of the Washington State Attorney General's office. And we may be reached by phone at 1-833-660-4877 or by email. And our email address is civilrights@atg for Attorney General .wa for Washington.gov for gov.
And what are some housing discrimination cases that your office has pursued?
Sure. I'll give a few examples. So in one instance, we took legal action against a landlord. This might sound familiar from the examples I provided already about forms of housing discrimination, but we took legal action against a landlord that was towing the vehicles of African-American tenants only, even though white tenants also violated the no parking rule and no vehicles in disrepair on the property rule. To provide a second example, in another instance, we filed a lawsuit against a landlord who was sexually harassing a number of women who were his tenants, and he had done this over the course of several years. And some of those actions by the landlord included requesting sexual favors in exchange for doing the very things that the law already requires of the landlord, like making repairs or responding to rate maintenance requests to their apartments. And that's, of course, unlawful. And then to provide a third and final example, in another instance, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of our client, the Washington State Human Rights Commission. In that case involved discrimination against a mixed race couple. The individual who sold them a piece of land that was part of a subdivision of a multi-parcel area that he owned. He sold it to them, and then after selling it to them, he enforced land covenants that ran with that property on the mixed race couple only, and effectively ignored other individuals who were also in violation of these covenants, and ultimately ended up going so far as to sue the mixed race couple And we prosecuted that case on behalf of our client, the Washington State Human Rights Commission.
Wow, it seems like there are so many different ways for housing discrimination to look like. And thank you so much for providing all of those examples. That's super helpful. Language barriers is, something that a lot of people with limited English proficiency deal with. And language barriers can often make dealing with abuses of authority difficult. What resources would you recommend to a renter who has limited English proficiency?
Sure. So though not associated with our office necessarily, there's a great resource that's out there that I would be remiss not to mention. So I'll start there, and that's WashingtonLawHelp.org. It's a website, a really great online resource that's offered by one of our civil legal aid partners, the Northwest Justice Project. And it provides information about tenants' rights in the housing context generally and broadly, and it does so in multiple languages. So I want to mention that as a resource for individuals who just want to sort of navigate what my rights might be, right, in a particular context. In terms of discrimination specifically, I would also point individuals to the Washington State Human Rights Commission's website, which discusses a person's housing discrimination rights and other anti-discrimination rights beyond housing. And that website, which is www.hum.wa.gov, is also available in multiple languages. And then lastly, I would signal to individuals that please know that if you contact our team at the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office, several of our staff persons are bilingual, but in addition to that, we have access to a language line that allows us to speak to you with the help of an interpreter in virtually any language, and that's a great resource.
Awesome. Thank you so much for providing those resources, Patricio. I believe we have the Human Rights website and then the Washington Law information on our infographics that we posted on social, and we'll make sure we also include the Attorney General's office as well. Last question, what are 3 things you think every renter in Washington State should know?
Yes, great question, and thanks for asking it. First, I'd say that I would want every renter in Washington to know that the Washington law against discrimination protects all Washingtonians regardless of your citizenship status. And that's really important for folks to know. Second, I would say that I'd want to make the point that the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office is here to serve you. We're a state government agency, and we have nothing to do with the federal government or federal immigration officials. So please know that, and please feel safe in contacting us to report discrimination. And third, I'd say that if you're an individual who has experienced discrimination by your housing provider and you're considering filing a complaint with the Washington State Human Rights Commission, I'd want you to please be aware that you have 1 year to file your complaint after the discrimination happens. That's an important time period not to miss so that you can preserve your claim.
Thank you so much for all of this information and for joining us today, Patricio. We truly appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, and a pleasure to speak with you, Nejma.